Can you all hear me at the back? Is that, yeah, that's okay. All right. Well, if my voice drops, let me know. Good morning, everybody. So I'm here to try and set up today, really, by trying to demystify GDPR. Because it is obviously a very, if people know about it, it's a very complex piece of legislation. And but what I always try and do is break it down into the basic principles, so that it makes it a bit more understandable. So that's what I'll try and do. I mean, obviously, if anybody's got any questions, then I think we'll save them for the end. I think we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So, but if there's any really burning questions, then do stop me. Put your hand up. So what is it? You're probably aware it's the biggest change in data privacy law in 20 years. I mean, the current privacy law we have around data protection is way out of date, given the technology changes we've had since 1995, since the last EU directive. So it does need updating. It's EU legislation, but it affects more than just Europe. I'll explain that in a bit more detail later on. And then, of course, there's Brexit. Because it's EU legislation, often asked, does that mean we can ignore it because we're leaving? The answer is no. The British government's consistently said that. And you may have seen last week in the Queen's speech, one of the major pieces of legislation was actually a data protection bill, which is going to implement a GDPR and also do other things. So we will not be able to get away from it. Just some basic definitions. I mean, I've set them out in quite long form, but what is personal data? What are we talking about in terms of what's regulated by GDPR? So it's information about a living individual. Processed by automated means, so it's held electronically, for example, or it's held in a filing system. So don't forget paper records, they're very important, and if you're in the middle of GDPR compliance programs, it's one of the most difficult things actually to deal with is actually the paper, the old style paper records. Processing data, very wide definition, virtually anything you do with it, so collecting it, storing it, analysing it. So, for example, automated profiling to make decisions, which is a big thing in the insurance industry, is specifically regulated and is dealt with in GDPR. Transferring it to other organisations or indeed internationally, and even deleting it is an act of processing. And then the two main actors in this whole sort of managing data controller. So that's the organisation that determines what's done with personal data. And then the data processor is somebody who's acting on the instructions of the data controller. So best example of that is perhaps if you store data in the cloud, your cloud provider will typically be a data processor. So just bear those in mind as I go through, because I will be referring to them again. And then there are four main themes, so this is a simplifying bit. And I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail. There's a lot more to it than this, but this is really what it boils down to. If you can start with these building blocks, then you're onto a good thing. But before I get onto those, very important concept, 0 day. Okay, so 20th of May 2018 is 0 day. That's the day when this legislation actually takes effect. And we call it 0 day because everything has to be compliant by then. What I mean by that is imagine that you're fully compliant with the current directive and the current Data Protection Act, and you're processing data in the right way, you've got all the necessary consents, etc. Those consents may not be valid under GDPR, they may not survive. So if you process after 25 May 2018 on the basis of that consent, it may not be lawful. You may not be able to do that. So you have to think about reconsenting that data or looking at it in a different way. So that's the 0 day concept. So let's look at the four different areas. So the first one's extending the scope of EU regulation. So obviously the current legislation captures data controllers, but it's now being extended to these data processors as well, established in the EU. So data processors for the first time are directly regulated, so the cloud providers, for example. But it not only captures data controllers and data processors based in the EU, it also captures those outside the EU who are supplying goods and services into the EU, or alternatively are monitoring individuals in the EU. So basically what the EU is saying, if you want our data in relation to your business activities, you've got to play by our rules in relation to what you do with it. So that is particularly directed at the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons of the world. So and that's partly political as well. But and so what the EU is trying to do is extend its regulation around the world as a global standard. So, as I've said, processors now have direct statutory obligations, and there's also very granular rules around what has to be in the contracts between a controller and a processor, and specific items now need to be included. GDPR says what needs to be in there. So any new contracts that you're thinking of entering into as controllers with processors, or if you're a processor with your controllers, they need to reflect those terms if they're extending beyond May 2018. So start doing that now. But it's more complicated than that. Remember 0 day? So the existing contracts that are extending over to May 2018, things that have already been signed up, are going to have to be renegotiated. And as a lawyer, that's what I'm helping clients do right now, is renegotiate those contracts between controllers and processors. It's not necessarily an easy process and can be quite time consuming. There's also obviously there's a bit of negotiation going on as well around the risk now that processors are directly regulated, and the pricing around what the processors are now supposed to provide for controllers. So it's not easy. Second key aspect, empowering individuals, very important. There's been a definite shift. Organisations think they own the data. The EU has said no, it's the individuals who own their data. The organisations effectively have the information on loan. So that's an important concept. So one of the most important things there is the question of consent, and consent is being tightened up. The definition is here. Basically what it means is if you've previously got consent on an opted out basis, so somebody has to tick a box to say I don't want this to happen, that won't work. You've got to get them to opt in and tick to say I want this to happen. That's a big change. And then also in relation to that, not just about consent, but individuals also have the right to know in a lot more granular detail what you're doing with their data. And also they've got rights to withdraw consent, to delete, have data deleted if they want it deleted. They've even got this right to data portability, which is a big issue for banks and insurers. So perhaps you're providing insurance to a particular individual, they want to move to another insurer, then they can say, well, I want to port all of the data you've got on me, I want you to port it over to the new provider. Or alternatively, they want to port from somebody else to you, then you need to have the ability to take that data in. So that's a big change. And some of you have come across, I'm sure, subject access requests. This is where an individual says, tell me what you're doing with my data. That's under the current law. That's being retained in GDPR. There's currently a fee of £10 which has to be paid in order to get access to that data. The individual has to pay. That's being abolished. And I'd expect that subject access requests to be a lot more of them. So here are the main aspects or main impacts of that. So the transparency piece about telling people what you do with their data means you have to know what you're doing with their data in order to tell them. And actually, when you ask organisations, well, what are you doing with individuals' data? When you do that data mapping, and they think they know what they're doing, but in fact they're doing a lot more. And that is quite a big piece, that whole sort of data discovery piece. And remember as well, this isn't just electronic records, this is paper records as well. Consent, because it's now going to be so difficult to obtain, there's a lot of organisations looking at seeing if they can justify the processing that they're doing on other grounds, and there are a series of other grounds that have largely been ignored up to now, but they're being focused on very hard. So oddly, in fact, although the regulation intends to give people more rights in terms of getting more consents, organisations are looking to try and work around that, and there are some quite clever ways to do it. You need new privacy policies, whatever grounds you're relying upon in terms of processing, and that's both for new customers you're signing up now, who are going to carry on over beyond May 2018, but also remember for existing customers, so don't forget 0 day. So you're going to have to explain to those existing customers what you're doing if you're still processing their data or will be after May 2018. Again, that's a big job. And you're also going to need new functionality in terms of the platforms, the technology platforms you have to cope with all those enhanced rights, which I explained. So can you find people's data? Can you delete it if they ask for it? Can you port the data to another provider if they ask for you to do that? Next aspect, building privacy into products and services, the concept of privacy by design. You have to build it in at the beginning. So often what happens is people come up with new products and services, they work out, well, what's the cost of developing this? What can I make as a margin on it? The business goes off, develops it, and then sometimes as an afterthought, somebody says, hang on a minute, what am I doing with people's data? What are the privacy impacts? Can we do this? But that's no longer good enough. You can't do it at the end, you've got to do it at the beginning. So that's the concept of privacy by design. And it encompasses things like data minimization is mentioned here. Should data be anonymized or pseudonymized in the process? So do I need to have data in the clear, or should I put it under the lock and key? Do I need to segment data into particular areas of the business who are the only ones who are supposed to use it? Security safeguards, very important. And the difficult thing is, do employees understand this? So are the people who are doing the day-to-day processing and also designing new products and services, do they understand it as well? There's a training aspect there. So main impacts, that employee piece is a massive cultural change. I think it's the most difficult thing for organisations because frankly, to date, nobody's really cared about personal data, but now they have to because the risks are so high. So people really are the main challenge. You've got this new compliance role, the data protection officer, a new regulatory role. You're a regulated industry already, and you're familiar with regulation, but this is a new regulatory role that needs to be looking after the data side of things and has to have direct contact into the regulator, to customers, advising the business, advising the board, very empowered individual. And as I've said, it's not just about new products and services, this privacy by design concept. You're also going to have to look at what the existing products and services that you're offering and see if they are compliant. So you may need to be re-engineering things in quite a major way to deal with these new privacy obligations. Final thing, obviously, sanctions and enforcement. So because this is supposed to be taken a lot more seriously, the sanctions and enforcement regime is very much strengthened. At the moment, most business sectors, there's no mandatory breach notification requirement. That now will become standard, and the reporting timeline, 72 hours, is very tight and very difficult to comply with. There's also an obligation to report serious data security breaches directly to the individuals affected. So you're telling people that you've suffered a breach directly, the affected individuals. And processors and controllers have to cooperate. Regulatory fines, very high. This is into sort of the territory of antitrust cases or some of the more serious financial services breaches. 20 million euros or up to 4% of annual worldwide turnover, not profit. So that's very serious. And there's also encouragement to individuals to bring claims because there are mechanisms to allow them to bring group litigation if, for example, there's been a data breach. So it's all very serious, and the consequences of getting it wrong are serious. What's the focus for regulators? The ICO, the Information Commissioner, who is the data protection regulator, her focus, she's quite new, she's a Canadian lady who's done this already. She did a very similar program in Canada over the course of 10 years. Her focus is on this concept of accountability, which means not just being compliant, but being able to demonstrate that you've got a culture of compliance in the organisation. And she is likely to audit against that. And these are the sort of things that she'll be asking if she proactively investigates that. UK government focus very much on cybersecurity. They like GDPR because they think it's going to make organisations a lot more cyber secure, which they think is good for UK industry. And so how will this be enforced? Well, the regulator will engage in some proactive audits. I've said at the bottom, the insurance industry is likely to be a focus for enforcement. I think it is likely to be a focus because it's such a data-rich area and it's quite high profile. So I think there may be some proactive audits in relation to people who are involved in the insurance sector. But also this will be driven by reactive investigations So after data breach reports, which you're going to have to make to the regulator because of this mandatory breach notification, they'll investigate why the breach happened. And what the regulator will be looking for is not just this particular incident, but does it indicate any systemic problems in the organisation? That's what she'll be looking for. And then in relation to individuals who are already seeing this are a lot more aware of their privacy rights, and I would expect that they are going to be making inquiries of organisations, what do you do with my data? If they don't get a satisfactory response, complain to the regulator, and the regulator will, I'm sure, feel obliged to investigate those as well. So there are two main ways into reactive investigations. And then achieving compliance, how do you go about it? Very simple, this diagram or this flow, but this is basically it. You need to appoint compliance leads in the business. You probably need a DPO. You need people in the business who are interested in this and want to help you do it. I call them data champions, so in each business sector. And you obviously need board buy-in. It's quite an involved process, and it can be quite expensive in terms of time and using outside consultancy. Then you need to understand the data you hold and what you do with it, as I've explained. And then you need to be analysing your processes in quite a lot of detail, finding the gaps, and then re-engineering those processes sometimes, or changing your procedures, policies, your third-party contracts, so the controller process contracts. You then need to train staff, so again, changing culture change is very, very important. And then you need to be testing and enforcing compliance. So it's not enough to just train the staff, you've got to keep an eye on it, and then if they're getting it wrong, then you need to be enforcing against the standards. And as I've said, remember 0 day, 25th May 2018. My advice is try and be ready 2 months before that, because there's always teething problems and there's always tweaks you need to make. And that's me. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, all right.